Recording. All right, guys. So we made it to Friday, and we're going to continue on our new site challenge. So we have new site 3 that we're going to tackle, and this is going to introduce an API that we've kind of coded up for you. So we're not going to be using a third-party API. We're just going to be using our own, internal API where we service the data and kind of request that from our client side. All right, so let's kind of review what we've gone over some of this week. So we talked about React. Again, this is a new language, or I guess new set of tools we're using with JavaScript. So just to go over terminology, a React component is just, a modular piece of code. So the way I like thinking of it is basically if we go back to our Python discussions where we had classes, I kind of view components as classes, right? So they kind of template out what you want to do. You can reuse them pretty easily and create multiple instances of classes, or you could have multiple instances of the same component. So much like classes, we could pass in parameters. So instead of parameters, we have props that we pass to components. So we have a parent component, and that might want to pass data to its child components. And we do that via props. So props, again, are just kind of short form for properties. That's just data we want to kind of pass down into our child components. State, on the other hand, again, if we're just kind of comparing it to classes, because again, that's something that makes sense to me. Again, I don't know if that makes sense to all of you guys. But when I think about state, that's more just like attributes that you have within your class. So again, React components are class. States would be those attributes that we have. Again, going back to our Python days, we could have instance attributes. So that's what state kind of reflects. And then props are the values that are passed into our constructor for our class. So again, I know I'm kind of mixing and matching the terminology there. So let's go back to React. So components are just reusable pieces of code for rendering front-end objects. State would be internalized data, and then props would be data that's passed in from above. So our parent component will pass it down to a child component. All right. We had a challenge early in the week, but just to reiterate, states and props should not be directly modified. We have set ways to update them. States, we use the use state hook when we're using functional components. And then for props, we shouldn't modify those. Those should be immutable when we pass them down from our parent to our child. All right, so hopefully these concepts are kind of making sense. Again, it is new terminology and kind of a new way to do JavaScript. But hopefully, again, I find it useful to kind of think about classes. If you guys understand classes, I feel like components are similar in nature to that. Any questions on, again, just kind of go over the terminology, what we've done with React so far, and kind of clarifying anything that needs to be clarified? Definitely want to take time today to make sure we're all on the same page. So any questions out there? Okay, so again, hopefully this is all making sense. If there's still confusion, definitely reach out and we could definitely go over this more in detail. But moving on, we're going to be, as kind of hinted before, we're going to be using an API. So this API is just going to service data for us. We're going to request data from this API and then use it in our news site. So this will mimic a more real world situation where, again, news data, we're not going to be generating news data ourselves, right? Like we're not a news provider. But we might want to consume news data from some source, whether it be like CNN or the AP, or it could be like a conglomerate or I guess an aggregate of news sources where we can just get news headlines and display them on our website. All right, so that's what we're going to be doing today. But we're going to take a step back. So promises. This was a construct or a concept that we introduced a few weeks ago. I'm going back to Wednesday, March 3rd. So that's almost exactly a month ago. We talked about asynchronous JavaScript and using fetch. So again, we introduced it. We didn't use it a whole lot, but we're going to be using it much more going forward. So definitely good to kind of brush up on what we talked about a few weeks ago. So yeah, let's jump back to today. So a month ago, we talked about promises. So let's kind of review promises. Again, this was, for me, like promises aren't like, a snap of the fingers, I understand them. I kind of got to look at them and kind of, make my mind kind of adjust to what promises are actually doing. So let's take a look at a general example here. Let me maybe make this a little bigger. So this is the general syntax for a promise. So we got to use the new keyword in JavaScript to create a promise object. Promise with a capital P is the object that we're creating. This takes in a function as a parameter. So it's always gets kind of confusing when we have multiple functions, like a function calling, like a function that's passed into another function, and you can do that multiple times, or go multiple levels of that. So in this case, again, a promise takes in a function, and that function takes in two other functions. So it's functions within the function, sort of. Those two functions are basically going to handle our success case or failure case. So on success is a handler, and on failure is a handler also. So this function, we pass in two functions as parameters for that. And then inside our promise, we're going to do something. That something generally is going to take some amount of time, which is why we want to make this asynchronous. So that do something with regards to our website generally will be API calls. So we don't know how long an API call is going to take. If we're getting a lot of data, it could take several seconds for us to get it. We don't want to halt our website or like make our website unusable during those few seconds for a user while reading that data. That should be getting the data should be in the background. It shouldn't, we don't want to just make the user wait if they want to do something else with our website. So that do something is going to take a certain amount of time. Once it's complete, it's going to return some condition, and then based on that condition, we could determine if we've succeeded with our task or if we failed. All right, so like again, if we want to put this into a real world concept, like if we call our news API to get news results, we'll get some condition saying, hey, you got your news results, we'll get the data back, and then we can pass that data to our success. Like, hey, here's all the articles we got, we were successful, consume it. If there was a case where like the API was able to return an error saying, hey, no articles can we return? Well, we don't have any data to pass back. So in that case, we might return a message saying, hey, no articles exist, or whatever else we think is sensible. All right, so again, this is definitely a complicated structure, so it takes some time to kind of understand what's going on. But yeah, so there's two parts of it. One is creating a promise. So this is where we created our promise. We outline what we need to do. And then our second phase is actually consuming our promise. So we have our promise. Once we get the data back, we want to do something with it. So in this case, we're just returning a string. But the key thing to remember is we can return any object that we want. So a string, kind of just easy to understand here. When we have a success case, we return success. And then we consume that data that's passed back. So in this case, it's a string. And we simply print out to our console. All right, so again, we're going to get success and print it out just for console. Nothing too fancy going on here. But if we did fail, if we got the failure case, that's where the .catch comes into play. So .then, it handles the success case, and .catch will handle the error case. And there are a couple ways to do this. So if I go back to our previous lecture notes, I think I covered it there. A lot of, yep. So let's see if I can present this. All right, so this was the example I used, again, a few weeks ago, so you probably don't remember it, but the key thing at the bottom here, where I pour serial, I could also pass the error case, or the error handler, to the .then. I always have trouble saying that, .then. So the pour serial would be the success case, and the go hungry would be the failure case. As in, go hungry will handle if we have a failure from our wash dishes promise. All right, but the other way to do it, if I continue on, we could just have a .catch that captures any failure case from any of these promises that are executed. So if we wash dishes in error, we'll call the go hungry handler. If we fail pouring our cereal, then we'll also be caught by the .catch. All right, so two different ways to do it. It's kind of user preference. Sometimes the failure handler might be different for each case. Like if we're washing dishes and failed, instead of going hungry, we might go to, I don't know, the grocery store or department store to buy new dishes in case you broke them while you're washing them. I don't know how you could fail at washing dishes, but it can happen. All right, but if your failure case is the same, like for example, if you just want to print out an error message, no matter what happened, like what failure occurs, then you might just want to have one general catch that will just print out an error message. All right, so I lost my tab. All right, so going back to promises, again, complicated concept. The good thing is we're not going to be working with promises directly, as in we're not going to create promises ourselves. It's kind of done for us via the fetch API. So let's kind of continue on. We have an example here. So I'm just going to kind of follow this code. In this case, we want to build a house. So building a house, again, takes some amount of time. So we got to do it in various steps. We got to build a foundation. In this case, we're assuming that'll take 1 second. Obviously, in real world, it's going to take much longer. But after we build a foundation, we proceed building our house. So we build our foundation, then we're going to build a frame, then we're going to build our HVAC, and then build our electrical system. All right, so these had to be done in order. We can't just do all 4 items at once. One relies on the other. So you can't, build your electrical system before you have your foundation built. All right, so let's actually, we can copy this code. Let's just see how it runs. So copy it. And let's create a new file. All right, so let's, again, just kind of take a look at this code. Each one of these functions is returning a promise. All right, so this promise is using a timeout. So it's going to simulate some amount of time it's going to take. And then once it completes, it'll resolve. So resolve is our success case. In this case, we're not dealing with our reject callback. We're just doing a resolve. All right, so the set timeout will just basically print out the action that was completed, and then we'll return success. Again, we could return a value here, like we could return a string saying success, and then this would allow us to use some return value. But in this case, we don't really want to return anything. We're just going to return nothing. All right, so again, let's take a look at this .then construct. So we're going to build our foundation first. After that promise resolves, we're going to proceed with our next task. In that case, we want to build our frame. All right, so let's run this and see what happens. I need to node.js. All right, so it's taking some amount of time. So that took 1 second, and then all these kind of come in order. So yeah, so our foundation takes 1 second, frame takes 2 seconds, HVAC takes 3, and then electric takes 2.5. So if you're following along on the page, this actually doesn't do quite what we wanted to, because we got we want to do our build our electrical system after our HVAC is completed. But that does not happen with the contract we had here, because the electric system took 2.5 seconds and actually completed before our HVAC was built. So kind of just going off the page, we want to take advantage of fat arrow functions. So this is not actually calling a function. This is specifying a function to be called. So the difference, again, we kind of saw this in React. When you have a function and put parentheses on it, that's actually going to invoke it at that moment. So I know I ran into a case where I was had an onClick handler, but I was actually calling the function right in the onClick handler. That's not what I wanted to do. I wanted onClick to call a function when the onClick event was fired. So in that case, that's why we want to use these fat arrow functions. This is going to specify when we want to make a function call, it's going to call build frame. It's not going to call build frame right away. So if we switch to that, copy this, and update our example. All right, so now we're specifying what functions to call when the success case is returned. So if we run that, takes some amount of time, foundation was built, great, frame got built, HVAC got built after 3 seconds, and then 2.5 seconds, electric got built. So now we're actually going in order where when build foundation returns, it's going to call any function. All right, so a lot to read here. One thing I did skip over, where'd it go? There's a discussion about AJAX. AJAX is kind of the old way to make asynchronous calls in JavaScript. So if you want to read about that, please go here. I've not worked with AJAX before, so some of the syntax is kind of foreign to me, but it looks very similar to what we were doing with promises. So there's a success case, an error case, and something that happens in each of those cases. So if you are curious about, I guess one way that you could do asynchronous events in JavaScript, look into Ajax. So we do have a write-up here. If this looks kind of familiar, we talked about the callback help in a previous presentation, and this is the idea of, it kind of makes your code unwieldy, kind of hard to read, and that's kind of why using promises is a little easier on the eyes, where you could just chain thens rather than nesting a bunch of, I guess in this case, HTTP requests. All right, so you guys can kind of read the Ajax page if you're curious what Ajax is all about. But for our purposes, we're going to use the more, I guess, newer way to do it, which is using fetch and promises. So again, promises, complicated topic. Don't worry too much about if you're still kind of fuzzy on it. Just kind of understand how you use them. You don't really necessarily know how to create them and work with them in the sense of creating new promises. We just want to know the .then will consume the result, and then we could chain those together. That's the key takeaway I want you guys to have here. All right, so something new that we did not go over the first time around with promises is that there's a different way that you can kind of structure handling promises. So .then is the way we talked about before, where you resolve a promise, and then after that promise is done, you want to do something else. And then after that promise is done, you might have something else to do. That's one way to do it. Async await is a different way to do it. I'm not going to say one is better than the other. It could come down to user preference. Sometimes it could come down to what exactly you're trying to do. .then might make more sense in certain cases. Async await might be better in other cases. I can't really say or give a great example in which cases one might be preferred, but for the most part, I would say it's developer preference. So it seems like some of you guys are familiar with async await, because I remember during the Wednesday's lecture, you guys were suggesting that I could use await to handle an async case. So kind of good that you guys kind of got ahead of the curve there and kind of maybe looked ahead or learned for yourself how to use async await. Well, let's actually look at this syntax and compare it against the .then syntax. All right, so there's this await keyword in JavaScript, and that essentially simulates an asynchronous event. So the way we use it would be we call await on a promise, and then this will actually wait for this promise to resolve before executing the next line. So again, this is sort of simulating a multi-threaded, or I guess asynchronous application. But as we talked about, JavaScript is actually not multi-threaded; it's single-threaded still. So the big caveat that I've highlighted in bold and underlined, and definitely want to make sure you guys understand, you can only use the await keyword inside of async functions. So async is another keyword that we're going to introduce here. You can specify that a function is asynchronous, and that means that it will behave as if JavaScript is asynchronous, but it won't actually block your code. So what I mean by that is async functions will essentially do what we're doing with our .thens, but it's not going to, your execution in your code is still going to proceed. So if we call build house, we might call something after it, and that action will be actually executed. And build house will do its thing, and then once everything's resolved, we'll eventually return our return value after it's done. So again, we're talking about a lot of code. It's generally easier to see the code, so let's actually try it out. So let's switch our example to be async await. So again, the key thing to remember, and you'll probably run into errors, as in you'll get error output. So it's pretty easy to understand if you make a mistake. I believe the code will tell you, hey, you can only use await in async, but we'll kind of see that. So let's try converting this to an async operation. So, or not operation, but syntax. So for that, I'm going to create a function, and let's call that function async function, and this will be build home. All right, so again, the async keyword goes before a function. There are other ways to do this. So sometimes we have build, say, let's build home 2. If we want to use the fat arrow syntax, we totally can. But we put the async keyword right here. All right, I'm not sure what squiggly is here. We'll figure that out. But yeah, let's go with this version for now. So we're going to build our home. And to build our home, we first need to build a foundation. So let's do await build foundation. All right, and then just copy this. After we build our foundation, we're going to proceed to build our frame. And then we'll do HVAC. I guess I could have copied and pasted what I had on the curriculum, but oh well. So then after we do that, we'll return a done statement. Okay, so build home is going to do a few actions. One action is going to wait on others. So build frame is not going to execute until build foundation returns. And so if we want to, again, remember what build foundation is, build foundation will return promise, and that'll take some amount of time to complete. Okay, so let me go back down to my async await, comment out the dot then. And then let's actually call this function. So I'm going to call build home. There we go. And then also let's do something else. Let's just do a simple console.log and say happy good Friday. And let's put 1 here too. All right, so we're going to just print out some items, and let's see the order of events here. So I call console.log, I call build home, and I call another console log with happy good Friday. Okay, so let's actually see this run. So let me clear my terminal. Call node home.js. All right, so we got both our statements before any of the housing stuff got done. And notice that now we're proceeding with our housing stuff. So again, this is going kind of out of order, but the way JavaScript works is it's synchronous. So it executes line 52, executes line 53, and then executes line 54. But our async function basically will, how do I explain? So yeah, our async function is using the callback mechanism. So that's the, let's go back to our diagrams. If you guys remember this kind of monstrosity. So we talked about how your application will just go line by line. But if you have something that is asynchronous, it'd be pushed to the web API and kind of be executed behind the scenes. So, you know, set timeout will take its time. After it's completed, it'll push something to the event queue. That event queue will be pushed to the call stack when the call stack is empty. So that's what the event loop does. So again, this was kind of a detailed example, but once your call stack gets empty, your event will push the events from the event queue to your call stack. One additional note, and this is kind of technical, so apologies if it seems kind of confusing. This isn't actually the full picture. So there's an event queue, but there's also a promise event queue. So there's actually different levels of priority. The promise event queue actually gets priority over the normal event queue. So if you have a bunch of promises and then a bunch of like other asynchronous events that get queued up, once your call stack gets emptied, it'll actually take items off the promise event queue before dealing with the event queue. And that's just some technical knowledge there in terms of promises actually get priority. So yeah, just keep that in mind. I don't think you guys will encounter that or how to deal with it, but it's something good to know about. Okay, so let's go back to here. All right, so async await. I will say I prefer this syntax. It's easier for me just to read as a human. This makes sense. Like I'm going to await this action, and then once that's done, I'm going to proceed. To me, that makes more sense. If you prefer the .then syntax, that's totally up to you. Again, neither is more correct. It's sorry. Okay, yeah, neither is more correct. It's kind of what you think makes more sense to you, what makes your code cleaner. Both of them can have its benefits in terms of just readability. But for me, I think this is easier to understand. But with the wait keyword, again, you need to have an async function. Versus if you use the .then syntax, you're kind of free to use it as you wish or wherever you wish. Okay, I've been talking for a long time. Definitely want to pause for questions. So what questions do you guys have about promises or the new syntax we kind of talked about, the async await?
After that web API stack, is that only if you're requesting something from the web, or is that all, like, even the events in that, or the events in that function go to the web API stack before they go to the event stack?
Yes, so the web API, this is something that your browser provides. So if you're using Node, Node probably has something similar, but it's probably not called web API. I'm not sure what Node has. But yeah, this can be something else also. Again, depending on what your logic needs to do, like it might not call a web API, it might call your own third-party API that does work for you. But yeah, so this, I guess, can be replaced with something else. But the whole takeaway here is this is outside of your application. So work can be done while your application is progressing.
Got it. Thank you.
All right, so I guess let's continue. So again, this was a lot of technical stuff. Kind of read it if you're still kind of confused about how to use promises or some of the syntax. But for the most part, our main focus is going to be fetch. And hopefully I can say this if you agree or don't agree. I think fetch is pretty easy to use in terms of we just make an HTTP request, and then we can use the result once it's ready. So that's what fetch is doing for us. So we used fetch a little bit, I think in week 5, was it? But we're going to use it a lot more because we're dealing with web, and we're dealing with front ends, and then again requesting data either from third-party APIs, or we might be creating our own APIs. And we're going to want data that we can serve up to our front end. All right, so let's kind of take a look at fetch. So fetch, simply, you call fetch and you specify a URL. Fetch by default, or I guess not default, but the base behavior is a GET request. If you want to do a POST request, you can do a POST request with fetch, but you need to pass additional parameters telling fetch that, hey, you want to actually do a POST. But if you don't provide that extra information, so there's actually 2 parameters. Let's actually go to the documentation. So I go to fetch API. I'm not lose my page here. All right, so fetch API. A lot of text here. I'm not going to scan that right now, but let's look at the interface. So fetch right here. All right, so fetch takes in a resource, and then optionally can take in some initialization information. So the resource defines a URL of the resource that you want to fetch. And then init can have additional information. So like method, as we talked about, can be get, post. Again, there's other HTTP methods like delete, put. There's probably a whole host of other ones I've never used before or dealt with. But you can specify the method in the optional arguments, the header information. Again, post requests, you're usually like submitting a form. So that's what the body data would have. But there's a lot of additional options or parameters you can pass to fetch, but we're going to keep it simple because right now we're just getting data. We're not going to be actually posting or submitting data to our API. Okay, so again, documentation, a lot of development is kind of just reading documentation and kind of understanding how to use various APIs. So just kind of talking about this a little bit more. Fetch actually returns a response. So fetch is going to generate a promise, and that promise is going to resolve to a response object. So this is something we've not talked about too much in detail. Usually we don't need to know all that a response is, but some, I guess, useful parameters or attributes used from that response is there's a .ok. So if we make an HTTP request, we can observe this .ok value and determine if we actually got what we expected or if there's some error with the request. So again, with fetch, it's always generally going to succeed even if you don't get the resource you wanted. So if you try to make a call to like google.com and you get a 404 response, meaning that that request or that page doesn't exist, then you're still going to get a success from the fetch because it still fetched something for you. But you want to investigate the OK response code, which means if OK is true, that means the status, the HTTP status, was between 200 and 299, which is, again, the codes that are for successful HTTP request. But if you don't get an OK response, then you probably don't want to proceed, assuming that you probably don't want to assume that you have the correct data from your request. Right? There's, again, a lot on here, but one thing that we use is .json, but there's other ways we process data. There's .blob. Array buffer, again, I don't know too much about array buffer and blob. But text and JSON are pretty easy to understand. JSON format is what we've seen before. Text can just be you return a text file from your API response and consume it as normal text if you wanted to. But we usually use JSON, so let's kind of just focus on that one. So yeah, so this is what you're generally going to see. Again, from all the stuff we talked about, there's a lot of technical stuff. Don't worry too much about that. Just kind of understand this is the basic format you're going to want to use for making HTTP requests. We're going to use fetch, pass it some URL where our API is living, and then once, so this is using the await syntax, I guess we have both here. Once that request has responded, we're going to get a response. And again, that's a response object that we just talked about. So again, if you're curious about what other values you have access to, just read up on the response documentation. Again, there's headers that's returned, okay. You can actually look at the status. So if you want to know what status code you got back, that's available to you. Status text, again, this is all from the HTTP discussion. But yeah, there's a lot of data that's returned and you might want to use it. So read the documentation page if you're curious about what you can use or have access to. So we get a response. That's that response object. Then we're going to call response.json, assuming that our API is returning JSON data. And JSON is also going to be an asynchronous event. So it takes some time to process stuff from JSON. So in that case, this will return a promise, and then that promise will resolve to actual data that we want to use in our code. All right, so it's two promises. We're going to fetch. Once that fetch resolves, we're going to call .json. Once that resolves, we have our data and can use that readily. Okay, so again, a lot of talking, not a lot of coding. Usually it makes more sense when we code. So let's actually get into our new site 3 challenge. I'm going to open that up. And let's give that a glance. So we want to create something that refers to our API. So we're not actually creating the API. We give that to you guys. We want to create that using useEffect and then refactor. Okay, so we'll go through these steps and see if we can adapt those changes. So like before, we're going to iterate from what we worked on before. So I'm going to take my new site 2 code and then kind of adapt that to new site 3. So let's see if I can do this correctly. Get to this. CD challenges. All right, so let's get our new site 3. So we get clone. I need to fork this. And I can't fork it. Let's just delete all my challenges that I've done in the past because I find myself doing this often. All right, that should be gone. Let's go back. All right, so I'm going to fork this. All right, there we go. Fork away. It's taking its time, and there we go. All right, so let me grab that URL and clone it. All right, that was quick. Let's CD into that. So that was new site 3. All right, cool. So all right, we have our new site 3. So we have code given to us, but we need to adapt what we had before. So I had my new site 2. So let me actually grab what I had before from off screen. New site 2. All right, let's read what the README is telling us. So initial setup. Again, you have your choice. You can use a solution provided or whatever you coded up. So I'm going to use what I coded up. We want to copy over these specific files. So we have app.js. Let me do those one by one. App.js. So where's that? Source. All right, so app.js should replace this. All right, I'm having some issues here. Not sure what's going on. Won't seem to let me copy over my files. Copy. All right, I'm not sure I can't copy this stuff over. Ah, there we go. I think I just had a random file that was giving me trouble. All right, so let's replace what we have. Yep, replace. Sorry about that hiccup. All right, so we got app.js. Then we want to do our components. We have article, article list, article teaser. So I'm going to copy my entire components folder. That should be sufficient. So let's grab my components folder. Okay, so I copied over my files. I'm just following the directions on new site part 3. So I copied over my files from my new site 2, and we'll kind of make sure that everything's working correctly. But yeah, so app.js, all of your components and your pages that you created should be copied over. All right, so then after that, we want to start our server after we start our React app. So bring this up. All right, so if I do npm start, it's going to run some scripts. So let's actually take a look at what it's doing. So if I go to my package.json and look for start, we have React scripts that starts. That's just starting that. We also have this API that we've created. So we're not actually using that right now. I got some Bootstrap errors, so it seems like I need to install Bootstrap. We'll ignore that for now. All right, so I'll go to my localhost React. All right, maybe I do need to include that. So,
Ankur,
yep.
I don't know if this is appropriate, but I tried to do the npm install after copying my files over, and I just keep getting errors about how it can't resolve dependencies.
Gotcha.
And I'm not sure what's going on.
All right, so we have these files. It says to run npm install, but I think we're getting errors. Install. Yeah, we get dependency errors, and that says we React project not resolved. All right, so
there's a command to run just like to almost like force run legacy stuff. It might be within that error if you scroll up a little bit.
-- force.
The legacy peer dependency, that one worked for me.
give it a try. All right, that seems to be getting further. Thank you for this request. I feel like I didn't have to do this the first time around. You think like the version's updated and that's the issue?
Yeah, so I guess there's some sort of interdependency and one of them updated and kind of messed it up. So it's just using the legacy ones.
Yeah, sorry if you guys tried doing this on your own, ran into it, but it seems like some of you guys figured it out. Wasn't expecting this. All right, so it's going to take some time again. Let's contemplate life while it installs. All right, so just kind of reading ahead for our API, we're going to have the ability to fetch articles by ID. So this want to show a particular article. And we also have sections. So we have like world, opinion. We can get a list of articles by section from our API, and then we also filter it. All right, so that's something we're going to be adding to our existing news site. So got some warnings. Hopefully that'll be fine. Go. And I'm going to talk to my files over. Okay. That finally worked. Thank you all for those suggestions. For that, let's copy my files over. That was trying to do before. So we want app.js. We can replace the existing app.js. Replace. Then we want our components from new site 2. There. What did I just do? All right, components get replaced, and then we also want to do pages. So let me copy that folder over. Drop that into source, and yes, please replace. All right, I think that should be what we want. Let's do npm start and hopefully it works correctly. All right, so starting the API and our client. So we're on the right track finally. Hopefully a web page should pop up shortly. Maybe. Doing something. Okay, all right, so this is my new site 2. It's not styled as probably as nicely as yours, but we have the base functionality that we had. So we have our headers that don't do anything right now. We have all of our articles that we can get to and see the details for. All right, so cool. So that's the new site 2. Let's go to new site 3 editions. So scroll up. All right. So far, the data was with a static JSON file. We're going to move to using an API. So let's actually see what kind of data we get. I'm going to copy this URL and just paste that into my browser. Okay, notice we get a JSON formatted file or data. We have article title, all the fields that we had before. So this is what we're going to get returned when we go to localhost 3001. That's where our API server is running. And we go /API/articles. So we get all this data back, and then we're going to consume this data in our React app. All right, so that's what we get here. Endpoint returns list articles. We also filter it. So if you want to specify a filter or specify, like a byline by this author, we can do that as well. So let's try to do that. I'm going to copy this, and let's see if that turns. So we're providing values in our URL. So let's try that. Okay, so we get one article back. Again, we search by this byline value. So that's what was specified in our URL filter by byline, and then has a value there. So, okay, that seems to be working as we expect. And we also do by article ID. So let's try that one. Go article, fill in an article ID here. So let's do article 4. Nope, that's not the one. Let's try that again. Copy. Paste. I've got my H here. There we go. And then let's get article 4. All right, so article 4 is by Alison Smalley. So let's actually check our website here. So it should be ordered at, all right, these are probably ordered by time. All right, so article 4 should be that. So we'll verify that when we get it in our front end. All right, cool. So API seems to be working as we expect. So we can kind of proceed. Article API.js is a module primary functionality. Let's take a look at what's been given to us. API, article. All right, so we have some functions with no functionality. So this is where our task is going to be for USite 3. We want to have the ability to, again, fetch by an article by ID or by section, or just get all articles as we desire. All right, so let's actually see what they're asking us to do. We have these three functions that we just found. For this, you want to use fetch and async await. So these are the concepts we talked about earlier. We're going to use fetch to make the API call, and then async await will kind of handle the asynchronous part of it. All right, so they give us an example where they're fetching some movie data. So you can kind of look at that, but eventually we want our code to look something like this, where we have a try catch. Again, so this was catch any errors for us. We have an async function, and then we could use await on our fetch request and then our response processing. So let's try to get this something like this into our code. All right, so let's go here. I'm going to do fetch articles because that one is going to get all my articles. So to do that, I'm going to what I want to do. I want to get a response. So let's do let response, and I'm going to call fetch. So fetch is going to take in the URL. So in this case, I want to get all articles. So that's localhost 3001. I'm going to paste that in there. All right, so again, this should return all articles, but fetch, again, is asynchronous. So this is where I'm going to use the await keyword, but that huge caveat that I mentioned before, you can only use await in asynchronous functions. So let's actually try to proceed with this and see what happens without async right now. And then let's see, this will get response.json. It's also asynchronous, so that's the await keyword here, and then we'll return JSON. All right, so fetch articles. We're going to call that from our homepage. Look at homepage. All right, so right now we're getting news from our data, but we want that to be dynamic, as in we want to get it from our API, not from our internal data. So let's actually try to figure this out. All right, let's read on. Set mode, there are two components. We have homepage and article page. We're importing from news.json, which we just saw. A lot of text here. All right, so we're using class-based components. We're going to use component did mount. This is a life cycle method, which will get automatically called after your initial render has been completed. So let's see what they have here. All right, let's try to just copy this over and adapt it. All right, I'm going to copy that. And we're going to adapt. This is not appropriate for our code. So we have a component did mount, which is an async function. We're going to call our API. So in this case, let's import article API from our API folder. So when we go .API string here, .API, and then in that we have article API. Again, so we're just trying to link to or import this file, which has our fetch methods. So we're in homepage. All right, so again, component did mount is a pre-existing function. I can't just name this whatever I want because React is going to call component did mount after the render. If I name this something else, it would not work as I would expect. All right, so we have our article API, and replace this call with fetch articles by. Let's get fetch articles. All right, we want to get all the articles, and this will return our JSON data. And then looks like we're setting a state. All right, so let's make this articles. And that's going to be the JSON response. And then we want to show our articles here. All right, so we're going to test this out. Definitely could have missed a step. Articles. But essentially, we have our API that has a fetch articles method. This, if you take a look at it again, is actually going to call our API, process the JSON, and return that JSON. And this should return as a promise. So when we get it here, this is also going to await that async call, and then we'll get that JSON response back and then store that as a state in our class-based component. So if all goes well, we should pass down articles to our articles. But always good to test. We have an error, articles is not defined. So we need to create a state. So what's going on here? So articles is not defined.
This dot state?
Yeah, is it supposed to be this dot? Right.
Here. All right, let's go back. It's functional components, refactoring. All right. So state, we need a state, and this dot state looks like what we had before. That just be state. Why are you complaining to us?
Does the articles that we're passing in need to be this dot state dot articles in the article list component?
Article list component right here.
Yeah, would that need to be this dot state?
Yeah. That, yes, that is one error, but it seems to be complaining about line 7.
You already fixed that one.
Oh, am I? Okay, I guess I was scrolled. All right, cool. All right, await, parsing error, unexpected reserved. All right, yeah, so this is what you'll see. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't realize I was scrolling all the way up. I tried using await, but I did not have it in an async function. So it's going to say unexpected reserved keyword or some error like that. And this is, again, because I'm trying to use await without having async function. So let's actually fix that. So it adds async here. Now, if I save that, all right, cool. I got some warnings. Used is defined but never used. That seems okay. But yeah, so again, you got to have an async function in order to use await, otherwise you won't be able to do it. All right, so that should be good. Let's refresh. Okay, so nothing seemed to change, but we did actually hook up to our API rather than using our static data. So if we actually want to, yeah, so nothing changed. It seemed to work. We can still click on articles. It seems to be working just fine.
Question.
Is there a question?
The component did mount function.
Yep.
You're creating it and calling it all at the same time?
No, so I create it, and then React is actually going to be calling component did mount. I am not calling it manually. So this is, if you want to compare it to like functional hooks, this is like use effects automatically gets called. I don't actually call use effects. Sorry, this gets called automatically. Whenever this updates, like when some data from API updates, this will get called automatically. I don't invoke this function myself. I do call use effects to kind of set that up, but whatever logic is here, React is going to call it automatically. So yeah, component did mount again is a predefined function call that will happen from React, and it's gonna, if you define this, it's gonna call this after your initial render of your component. Yeah, so I'm not calling that myself to make that clear, but yeah, good question there. Okay, so it seemed like this worked as we expected. Again, it's always good practice to have a try catch, because if something does go wrong, we definitely want to know about it rather than like causing our web page to have an error, ungraceful error show to our user. All right, so that seemed to work just fine. Let's see what else they want us to do.
Cool. Why did you have to use component did mount? Like, why couldn't you just call fetch all articles in the homepage?
in the homepage. So where would I call that in the homepage?
Like instead of replace the component did mount function with fetch all articles.
Gotcha. So do this. Yeah.
No, like replace the whole thing, all of it, lines 11 through 20.
Okay.
Like you put fetch all articles inside this component did mount function. Can we just call fetch all articles and put the error inside that function? Does that make sense?
No, I'm a little confused. So we want to call this. You're saying instead of doing all of this here, we just call fetch articles. Where would we store the result of fetch articles? Like here, maybe? Is that what you're suggesting?
Weren't you already returning the articles from in fetch articles?
Yeah, so this is returning articles. So we're just setting that on our state.
Okay.
Sorry, I might be misinterpreting your question, but yeah, so this returns our articles, and we're just taking that response, and we're not doing anything with our response aside from just assigning it to our internal state.
I think Christian's asking if we could just move the function from the articles API page to here and then just completely replace the component did mount.
So like move this here?
I believe so. Is that where
Yeah,
you're asking?
the whole thing, the whole function. But not replace, but like delete all of component did mount and just replace it with fetch all articles.
Okay.
So I think what he's saying is that, like, why use the did component did mount in the first place?
Gotcha. So that's part of our lifecycle method. So I don't know if we need to go into here, but there's a flow. So once we want to do this after our component has rendered. So our lifecycle, like there's a bunch of lifecycle methods. We haven't gotten too much into this, but once it's ready, we could logic that we want to do after the initial render will be done in our component did mount. We don't necessarily want to do it before our component has been created, because if our component like doesn't have state articles, yeah. So let's say we get our articles, we might not be able to pass it down to our article list because our article list might not be rendered at that point. So like our articles will update, but that update might not be processed. I don't think that was a clear answer, but basically it's just correct data flow. So component did mount is going to happen for sure after initial render. So we want to do this stuff after we've rendered our component.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, so we're getting all articles. What else do we need to do here? I have a lot of tabs open. Close these. All right, so we did this, we adapted it, and then since we're working components, calling this set state triggers component update at this point render. Okay, so we want to, our goal ultimately with new site 3 is to not rely on news.json. So we remove that from our homepage. Let's look at our article page. So we're still using our news object here. So let's comment that out or just delete it. Where are we using news? So for our article page, we are using the article ID from our, what is this, props.match params. Yeah, so we're using an article ID, and eventually we're using our static data news. We don't want to do that. We want to actually use our API, and we have a way to fetch an article by ID. So that's something we want to implement. Let's proceed with that. So I'm going to copy this. But our URL is going to be a little different. So if I have that tab still open, yep. So we want to do API/articles and then the article index. So let's change our URL. So article. And then we want some ID here. So we'll use string interpolation, which requires backticks. And this will be the article ID that we specify. And okay, so this should return one article object, and we still need to process the JSON. Again, our data is going to look like this. It's going to be a single article. So we'll get JSON response, and then return that article data. So I'm going to go to my article page, and again, we got rid of that news that we had here. So I'm just going to comment it out in case we need it again. Here, I'm going to import our API again, article API from .API / article API. All right, cool. All right, so now we have our article API here. We can actually make this request. So generate article is what's being rendered, but we need to, instead of using news, we want to use article API, and it's going to be fetch article by ID, and then maybe I shouldn't have to delete what I had before. All right, this.props.match.params, it's a long string, so let's move that here. And then we'll do article API fetch article by ID, and that's going to be this value. Okay, so again, this is going to be asynchronous though. So we don't know when this is going to return, so we need to kind of adapt our code here. All right, so we are updating our article page. All right, so we're going to add our lifecycle method in here. So we're going to do async component did mount. Again, this is the same thing we did in our homepage. Component did mount. I think VS Code is trying to help me. There we go. Did mount. And then we're going to do the same thing we're doing in the homepage, but just using a different API call. So let's copy and paste that. This is what we want to do. All right, so in this case, we're going to need a state value to keep track of that. So once this returns, it'll update state, and then state will force a re-render. So in this case, I want just an article object, so article, singular, and that'll be an object. And then get rid of
line 13 and 19.
Pardon?
There's you wrote our article on line 13 and line 19.
Article, right, did I type all this stuff correct? No. Article API, okay, cool. Sorry about the typos. All right, so we created a state within our article page, and then we're gonna update that state once we get a response. So we don't know when that's gonna happen, but whenever that happens, set state will get called, and that'll force us to, I guess, we might need this still.
I think line 21 is supposed to be article, right?
Line 21. Yes.
And then can you go to articles API real quick?
Sure.
Is article on line 2, is it supposed to be API / articles article ID?
Yes, you're right. Good catch there. So we're still using articles. Sure, I change that. Okay, good catches there. All right, so we still need our article page. We still need a generate function, but this is not going to do what it was doing before. This is simply going to return our article, but we'll return it as an article component. So article, and then we're going to use our spread operator, if you guys remember that. So it's going to be this dot state dot article. All right, so our generate article function was return an article component, and we're going to break apart our article into individual components. So whatever the article has, so basically we're going to have a title prop, created date prop, a byline prop, abstract prop that's passed down to our article. So if we take a look at our article component here, that's stuff we're using. So again, just become more familiar with the spread operator if it kind of freaks you out. Shouldn't be too scary, hopefully, once you use it enough. But it is definitely something that's foreign and that we haven't seen it too much before. All right, so this will hopefully show an article. So let's save this, and we have errors. Article ID is not defined because I probably forgot to let this in. Article page. Oh, I deleted what I had before. Whoops. Let's get that back here. Let article ID equals. All right, so creating the article ID and then passing it in. All right, I think that's what we want. Awaits. All right, we got that error again in our fetch article by ID. Always remember you need to make async functions in order to use your await keywords. If we didn't want to use async await, we could use our previous .then syntax. So let's actually, we could actually adapt this and kind of see how that will look, but let's actually just test it out first to make sure we didn't break anything. I'm going to refresh this, click on an article. Let's click on article at tab. All right, we got an error. Meh. So I think this is a case where multimedia might not exist. So I think Tom might have run into this yesterday also. Perhaps that's the same thing.
Yeah, the data is changed from the news file we had, so multimedia doesn't exist anymore. It's just an
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a good lesson. So obviously this was on purpose, but you want to make sure you know what your data contains. So, oops, I clicked on that. But yeah, in this case, we have image as our URL. We don't have that multimedia section. So our data did change. So it's, again, good to be aware about that when using third-party APIs. You should definitely double check what data you are getting back instead of expecting a certain format. It's a good point there. So let's see. How can we adapt this so it doesn't break anymore? We're using image, so multimedia doesn't exist. Image, does map still work? You know what? I think this could just be. We still need to do this. All right. Sorry, I'm going to try to clean this code up. So if the image URL exists, let's do something with it. We're going to return image elements. This, drop this here. Is there a comment there? Oh, that's just the URL. Okay, let's get rid of all this stuff. Let's return image with the URL. So image should be a URL already. So that looks good. And then if that's not the case, return null. I think that's what we want, but always good to check. So no errors, got some warnings. There's a warning here. I didn't have alt. Oh, all right, let's give this a try, see what happens. Okay, seems to work. Let's just verify that. So let's click on a new article down here. All right, we got an image, so it seems like the image was resolved. Again, that was because of the data change, so thank you for pointing that out. We don't have a multimedia attribute or property. We have image, and that's a URL. So yeah, we had to update our code a little bit there. So definitely simpler now that we just have a URL instead of that multimedia array, but otherwise it seems to be working as we want. So let's take a look at our requirements. So we implemented component did mount. Again, that's a lifecycle method. This particular one fires after the first render. There's also other lifecycle methods. You can use them as you need. So in our functional component way, we use useEffect. And useEffect kind of combines a few lifecycle methods into basically one central place. So you kind of do everything you want to do in one place instead of having different lifecycle methods in a class-based component. Refactoring, so I'll leave the refactoring to you guys, but you can kind of update as needed. So we have sections. That's something that we do when we are going to click on our headers. So we're going to have to implement the third function in our API, filter by section, but that otherwise should be very similar. We're going to call some URL, and then we're taking in a section, so it's going to be similar to our article ID, where we call some URL with a value that's passed in, and we're just going to process the promise, process the data, and return it. All right, so let's actually try to convert this to a .then construct. Again, both should work. So in that case, I don't think I need this to be async. Let's see. So we're going to fetch something, and then we're going to do .then. So fetch returns a response. So that's why the response we passed here into the .then response, and then the response will do something. The response will keep that on one line. Response.json. All right, so this JSON will return JSON data. That's okay. So got some mismatch parentheses. All right, then and return JSON. That's what I want to do. To do it this way, process response to JSON, return JSON. Okay, so this is going to return basically the same thing as before. Let's verify that. If I didn't break anything, looks like I might have broke something. Yep, let's debug. So we're not getting anything back that we wanted. And what we debugged there. So fetch by IT, then return JSON. Actually see what's going on here. So I'm going to try debugging through my VS Code, which is something we've tried before. So we need to go to my debug window, create a launch.json file, Chrome, and 8080. I'm going to change that to 3000 because that's where my React server is running. Let's see if I could actually run this file. Something. Okay, so I'm using my VS Code debugger now, so hopefully I can get a breakpoint. Let's click on an article. All right, we're broken here, so these breakpoints will work. All right, we get here, we got a response object. Okay, and notice all the values in it. Let me try to blow this up a bit. Oops. All right, so notice we have like a status code 200, so it seems like we got our request returned correct. Our status is okay. Everything else seems to be in line, so let's continue. We enter JSON, so we have undefined. So something went wrong here. So that's what our issue is. We need to return here, so that's the issue. Got it. So I wasn't returning the processed JSON response, so that was my issue. All right, so let me get rid of this breakpoints. Let me demagnify here. And still seems a little wrong. All right, I lost my initial articles too. What's going on? Am I broken here? To all my articles. All right, there's my articles. Are you there? All right, there you are. All right, we're still not getting what we want. So let's add those breakpoints back in. Refresh. All right, so JSON looks good. We have this, and we want to return it. So what's the issue here? Let's add more breakpoints. So in my article page, I'm going to add a breakpoint here. Now let's see what our state value is. Continue. Right, put it here. Let's try relaunching this. All right, so we're almost done here. I just want to obviously try this with a .then construct instead of async await, which should be possible. But all right, got this. All right, seems like some errors being thrown. All right, not sure where this error is being resolved. So I feel like my catch should catch that. It seems like it's not. Wait. Try this. Notes.
Is your article ID, is it different now that it's a different like object that you're pulling from the API? Because you have it still as dot params or dot match dot params dot article ID.
Good question. I seem to be getting some response, but let's kill my debug window. Where are you? There you are. All right, so let's check my article ID. Yep, it's 0 as I would expect. I think this is the first item. So I think my article ID is correct. I'm getting the correct response here. Nope, that's the 404. All right. I'm not gonna waste too much more time on this, but it's definitely possible to use either. Obviously, I did not demonstrate that effectively. Okay, so I have an off by 1 error for the index, but I am getting an article back.
Anchor, I think your API says article API instead of articles API on article page.
Article page.
The JSON response article, should it be articles API dot fetch?
No, I named it article up here, though my API is articles, so I should have named it appropriately. So that is a good catch. But no, it's making this call. So the call isn't the issue. It's this return is not actually returning. But again, I'll spend my own time kind of debugging this. But I guess I could just convert this back to async await. It was working then, but it seems like there's something going wrong in what I'm doing here. So it should be returning the JSON data back to my caller, but for whatever reason, it's choosing not to do what I want. Refresh. All right, so again, if we continue, all right, now it seemed to work. It's one of those cases, JSON response, nope, that's undefined, not what we want. Continue. Okay, I'll debug this on my own, but otherwise, new site 3, mostly just using the API that we created, hooking it up via fetch. So you want to implement some methods in your API folder. There's an API articles API.js. There's three methods in there. We want you to implement them. I've implemented 2 of them using async await. I tried to convert one. I ran into some issues, but give this a try. Try both constructs if you just want to get familiar with them. But otherwise, new site 3 shouldn't be too much addition in terms of React. It's more just processing data in a different way.